Welcome to the Florida Master Naturalist Program, an environmental education curriculum designed to increase awareness and appreciation of Florida's natural resources. Your host is Dr. Marty Main, wildlife ecologist with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Join Marty and his special guests as they take you on a tour of Florida's spectacular natural world.
Florida's lakes, rivers, and springs are permanent wetland habitats. That is, they typically hold water all year round. And because of this, they provide a certain water reliability that enables them to support a great diversity of fish and other aquatic organisms, as well as being very important for wildlife and as centers of human activity. This site may not seem to have much to do with permanent wetlands, but in fact it does. Florida's geology has an awful lot to do with Florida's permanent wetland systems. Florida is basically the product of a rising and subsiding sea level, which over millions of years has left a base rock of limestone known as karst. One of the characteristics of karst is that it's easily dissolved by percolating rains. In areas where a shallow depression has been formed, shallow lakes or rivers may exist. In areas where the limestone has been dissolved and then the overlying substrate has collapsed within it, deeper lakes may be formed, or in cases such as this at Devil's Millhopper State Park, a sinkhole may be formed. Sinkholes create the geologic foundation for many of Florida's lakes, but lakes may also form in shallow depressions. Such is the case with Florida's best-known lake, Lake Okeechobee. This is Lake Okeechobee, the largest lake in Florida, in fact, one of the largest lakes in the United States. Although Lake Okeechobee is very large, it's also pretty shallow. In fact, most of the lake is under 15 feet in depth. The shallow nature of Lake Okeechobee creates large areas of habitat near the lake shore, which is known as the littoral zone. The littoral zone of lakes is very important for fish and for wildlife, such as waterfowl, shorebirds, and wading birds. In Florida, during the fall and winter, that is during Florida's dry season, water levels decline in lakes and marshes and other wetlands. And this is very important for wading birds because it concentrates fish and other aquatic prey resources into small areas and provides a feast. Well, that's important for wading birds because this is the time of year when they're building nests and trying to rear young. Behind me, you'll see a concentration of great egrets, snow egrets, white ibis and glossy ibis, and a number of other wading birds. In fact, there's over 20 different species of wading birds in Florida. At over 400,000 acres, Lake Okeechobee is by far the largest lake in Florida, but it is only one of nearly 8,000 lakes that occur in the state. The majority of Florida's lakes are small, typically less than 150 acres in size, and most of these are located along Florida's sandy Central Ridge. One of the most interesting things about Florida's lakes is the great diversity of lakes we have in the state. This is Lake Shelar, a beautiful clearwater lake in north central Florida. This lake is so clear I can actually see fish swimming around in it. And so the question then is, so what makes this lake so clear? With me is Mark Brenner from the University of Florida. Mark, what can you tell me about Lake Shelar?
Well, Lake Shelar is extremely clear because most of the water that comes into this lake to fill it comes from rainfall that falls directly on the surface of the lake, and that water, of course, is very pure. The other kind of water that moves into this lake is rainfall that falls on these very sterile white sands and then just percolates through and fills the lake. There are very low nutrients in that water that's entering the lake, very low levels of nitrogen and phosphorus. Consequently, we get very little algal growth in a lake like this, and the waters remain quite clear.
Does the fact that this lake is so clear, does that make it healthier or better than a lake that's not so clear?
I would say no. In my opinion, no. It's just different. The lake is a clear water lake. Elsewhere we can move around the state and we'll find lakes that are dark water lakes, deeply stained with organic acids. And elsewhere we'll find lakes that we call eutrophic, ones that have a lot of algal growth and are very green.
Mark, in northern states, acid rain is a concern for the lakes there. What about in Florida?
Well, there has been some concern here, particularly with respect to lakes like Shelar. These lakes are naturally low in pH and would not be able to tolerate inputs of acidic precipitation.
Well, you know, I'd like to see some of these other lakes.
Well, let's go have a look at a dark water system now.
All right. Mark, this Blackwater Lake looks a lot different than Lake Sheelar.
Yeah, it's quite different in many respects, but one of the things that you'll really notice is if you look around the lake shore here, you'll see that there's swamp that comes right down to the edge of the lake. And another big difference that you'll notice too is if you grab a sample of water from a lake like this, a dark water lake, you'll notice that it has a very distinctive tea color.
Mark, the swamp fringe is having an effect similar then to the swamps along Blackwater River systems.
That's right. In fact, what happens here is water enters the lake, it passes through the swamp, and it picks up these tannins that are in the decaying vegetation. Here in north central Florida, those trees in that area would be mostly bald cypress and water tupelo.
Organic acids, also known as tannins or tannic acid, are natural compounds that occur in the needles and leaves of cypress and other trees. The tannins in these leaves stain water dark in the same way that tea leaves stain tea. Organic material from trees and other plants also contribute to conditions that promote plant growth in the littoral zone. Mark, there's an awful lot more plant growth in the littoral zone here.
Yeah, there is. There's a lot more. In fact, the forest comes right down to the water's edge, and then you pick up these emergent plants that go out into the lake considerably. And these provide quite a good habitat not only for invertebrates, but for juvenile fish.
Do these plants probably reflect differences in nutrient input?
They probably do, to some respect. And then also, one of the other things that you'll notice here, if you compare the situation, for instance, with Lake Sheelar, where we saw this nice sandy bottom, kind of like a beach, if you reach down here and look at what the bottom is, it's sort of a mucky bottom, organic material that's accumulated because of the plant growth.
I see. And what would happen if excessive amounts of nutrients came into a lake?
Well, what you might have in a case like that is what we call hypereutrophy, and sometimes there are negative consequences associated with that, like algal blooms, and potentially you could have fish kills.
Florida's lakes are diverse and numerous and represent an important type of permanent wetland habitat. Florida's rivers are also permanent wetland habitats and are critical resources for fish, wildlife, and humans. We'll be discussing three major river systems in Florida: alluvial rivers, blackwater rivers, and spring runs. This is the Apalachicola River. It's the largest river in the state. It's over 500 miles long, has a drainage basin of over 32,000 square miles that incorporate areas from Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. An alluvial river is so named because it carries large volumes of sediment. And one of the characteristics of an alluvial river is a major floodplain. One of the most unique aspects of the Apalachicola River, however, are the bluffs. That is a dramatic increase in elevation from the river up to about 150 feet above sea level. With me today is Joe Howard, Park Manager for Torrey State Park. Hey Joe, these bluffs are really fascinating. Can you tell me a little bit about how they were formed?
Yes, as you mentioned before, we're standing at an area now 150 feet above sea level. Down at the river is just 50 feet above sea level. And this area is the southernmost part of the Appalachian Mountains. And as such, we have a lot of different trees that you only find up in the Appalachian area and nowhere else in Florida.
I understand that this particular community is called a slope forest.
That's correct.
Can you tell me something about the trees that would be here?
Sure. On the slope forest, you're going to find different plants such as the elms. You're going to find the Ash's magnolia, which is a rare tree or a rare plant that you only find here, and some people call it the big leaf magnolia.
There's one other tree that's of particular importance to the Torrey State Park. And can you tell me about that?
Correct. The Torrey tree, which is the park is named after, the Torrey taxifolia, is one of the trees that are very rare and only found in this area along the Apalachicola River.
Joe, I'd like to take a look at some of the other components of the slope forest. Can we have a look?
Sure. Let's go.
Great. As Joe and I walked through the slope forest to the Apalachicola River, we discussed the slope forest community, which is a unique environment that supports many plants not commonly found in Florida. Bottomland hardwood swamp is another ecologically important habitat associated with the Apalachicola and other alluvial rivers. Bottomland hardwood swamps occur in the floodplains of alluvial rivers and are fed by the rich sediments suspended and then deposited throughout the swamp during flooding events. The nutrients associated with these sediments create excellent growing conditions that make bottomland hardwood swamps one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth, capable of supporting many different species of plants and wildlife. Joe and I also discussed aquatic life in the river, which includes a diverse collection of species, many of which are rare, and some that are endemic, which means they occur nowhere else. The Apalachicola River has an especially diverse fish community. Of the 126 species of fish known to occur in rivers throughout Florida, 83 occur in the Apalachicola River, including 3 endemic species and several others, such as the sturgeon, which have declined from overfishing or for other reasons. Are there any conservation issues? I understand the sturgeon's protected, but I mean, are there any other bigger conservation issues associated with the river?
Yes, periodically the thought comes up, or the issue comes up, of dredging the river. And I think right now the popular belief is that if you dredge, you're going to affect the shellfish fishing, down in the Apalachicola Bay area, which will be detrimental to that fishery.
The Santa Fe River in Olino State Park is a beautiful blackwater river that winds slowly through mixed hardwood swamp in north central Florida. Kelly McPherson of the Florida Park Service and I canoed along the Santa Fe and discussed how natural flooding events influence the course of blackwater rivers by forming and shaping the river banks, which are also sometimes referred to as river berms or levees. Kelly, this bank almost looks like a spoil bank.
Well, it is kind of, but it's been naturally formed. It's where sediments get deposited during flood events. And it's called a river berm or a river levee.
And now we're moving down here into this floodplain.
Yeah, and that's because when we have a flood event, there's often a lot of sediments suspended in the water, and when that water hits the bank where there's vegetation, it slows down and the heavier sediments fall out, forming that levee.
There's obviously a lot of cypress in here. You can see the cypress knees.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of deciduous trees, things like maples and sweet gum, river birches, among others.
They drop an awful lot of leaf litter, which is interesting to me because the leaf litter is the source of the tannic or the black water.
Yes, it actually, the leaves sort of steep in the water and give it tannic acids, which turn it that brown color.
We've discussed a few of the differences between alluvial rivers and blackwater rivers. The sources of these rivers also differ. Floodwaters of the Apalachicola and other alluvial rivers are fed by spring rains and by tributaries swollen with melting snow from the mountains of Alabama and Georgia. Consequently, there are very few alluvial rivers in Florida, and all of them occur in North Florida, primarily in the Panhandle. Blackwater rivers, which form the vast majority of Florida's rivers and are found throughout the state, originate in swamps, marshes, and lakes, and flood in response to Florida's abundant summer rains. The last type of river system we'll be looking at are spring runs. This is the Ichetucknee River, and one of the things you'll notice first off is the clarity of the water as opposed to what we observed with blackwater river systems and alluvial rivers. Another major difference is that the primary source of water for spring runs are springs. This is the head spring of the Ichetucknee River. There are 9 named springs that feed this river, and combined they constitute what's considered a first magnitude spring system, which means that they discharge over 100 cubic feet of fresh water per second. There are 320 named spring systems in Florida, all of which occur in North and Central Florida. Florida's springs are not all the same. They differ in size, chemistry, and in the species that inhabit them. Most of Florida's springs are freshwater. Most occur in the north and north-central part of the state, and nearly all of Florida's springs are the result of the vast Floridan aquifer forcing its way to the surface through cavities in the underlying karst base rock. it is estimated that roughly 8 billion gallons of fresh water emerges from Florida's springs each day. Florida's springs are important habitat for fish and wildlife, including unusual species that live deep within spring caves. In some cases, chemical composition of springs, which is primarily influenced by the sediments through which the spring water traveled, may be suitable for the survival of saltwater fish, and some springs do have saltwater fish, such as mullet, tarpon, and snook, to name a few. Springs have always been important to fish, wildlife, and humans. Today, Florida's springs are known internationally for their beauty and have become important recreation areas. The greatest conservation challenges for Florida springs may be to keep from loving them to death. Looks like a warmouth, John. Florida's freshwater systems support about 100 species of native fish and almost as many non-native fish. In addition to non-native fish, Florida's waterways support a host of other non-native organisms, such as this ram's horn snail. Now, the concern with non-native organisms is that they often compete directly with our native species. For instance, cichlids are voracious competitors with our native panfish, or brim as you might know them. Now, when trying to collect a sample, you may not always be able to locate a non-native fish or other organism, but one thing you will be able to see are non-native aquatic plants and their concerns associated with them as well. Today I have with me somebody that's intimately familiar with some of the problems associated with non-native aquatic weeds, John Cassani from Lee County Water Hyacinth Control District. How you doing, John?
Hi, Marty.
Hey, John, can you give me a couple of pointers on what some of the major problems are with aquatic weeds?
Yeah, some of them are really obvious. One is that because of their extreme abundance, they actually inhibit our recreational use, fishing, boating, swimming of the resource. Another might be that they have indirect effects on our native wildlife, and possibly another would be their indirect effects on our native aquatic vegetation as well. Sometimes they shade out the plants growing underneath, as an example.
John, I noticed some water hyacinth growing along this pond. Should we take a walk and talk about some of that?
Let's take a look. Marty, this pond gives us a real good example of several invasive aquatic plants that create quite a variety of problems. One good example is the water hyacinth. A couple others are hydrilla and hygrophila. The latter two grow under the water surface.
John, are there any redeeming qualities to these weeds?
Marty, obviously if you're out and about, you see wildlife, birds, and reptiles and amphibians using the plants as a habitat in some cases, but in most cases you'll see these plants proliferate, dominate the system, and really create a bigger problem.
I see. How did these weeds get into our water systems in the first place?
Most of the modes of entry, Marty, are accidental human introductions, sometimes through the aquarium trade, sometimes through the ornamental plant trade. We'll see these come in, and they accidentally are released into the system and proliferate as you see here.
Well, now that we've got these weeds, what are some of the strategies we're using to minimize the negative impacts?
Marty, we use three basic strategies for controlling these invasive plants. That would be mechanical control, where you physically remove the plants from the water, chemical control, and biological control.
Any success stories with biological control?
Biocontrol has had some very high-profile success stories, and one really good example is alligator weed, which was a problem several decades ago and is now under pretty much complete control through the introduction of a leaf beetle from Argentina.
The preceding was a short sample of the curriculum for the Florida Master Naturalist Program's Wetland Series. For more information, visit the Florida Master Naturalist Program website or contact your local University of Florida County Extension office.